The darkness in the hollow. The old farmhouse had been vacant for years, a dilapidated skeleton of a once lively home, standing isolated in the middle of the woods. Among the locals, it was known as the Hollow, a place where strange noises and inexplicable disappearances were rumored to happen. Despite the ominous reputation, when Emily and Mark decided to explore it, they saw only adventure. Mark had always been drawn to abandoned places, driven by a fascination for their forgotten stories. Emily, his girlfriend, was more cautious but willing to indulge him for the sake of their weekend getaway. They parked their old Jeep a mile from the farmhouse and hiked through the dense woods, their path illuminated only by the dim beam of their flashlights. As they approached the farmhouse, the air grew colder, and an eerie silence settled around them. The structure loomed against the darkening sky, its once white paint now peeling and stained with grime. Broken windows stared blankly like empty eye sockets. Inside, the house was a time capsule of decay. Dust hung in the air like cobwebs, and the wooden floors creaked under their weight. Emily shivered as she stepped over an old, rotting rug and took in the musty scent of abandonment. "This place gives me the creeps," Emily said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Come on, it's just an old house." Mark replied with a dismissive wave. "Let's check out the basement. I bet it has some interesting stuff." They made their way to the basement, the stairs groaning ominously with each step. At the bottom, the air was even colder, and their flashlights flickered as if struggling against the darkness. The basement was cluttered with old furniture covered in white sheets, dusty bookshelves, and cobweb-covered corners. Mark's flashlight beam landed on an old wooden door, partially hidden behind a stack of broken crates. He pried it open with a rusty crowbar he had brought along. Beyond the door was a narrow, stone-walled tunnel that sloped downward. "I don't know, Mark," Emily said, hesitating. "This feels wrong." "It's just an old root cellar," Mark said with a grin. "We've come this far. Let's see where it leads." They descended into the tunnel, their footsteps echoing off the stone walls. The air grew colder still, and a faint, unsettling whisper seemed to follow them, carried by the draft. At the end of the tunnel, they found a heavy wooden door with a rusty lock. Mark forced it open, and they stepped into a small chamber. The walls were lined with strange symbols and crude drawings. In the center of the room stood an old stone altar, covered in dark stains that looked disturbingly like blood. "This is bizarre," Emily said, her voice trembling. "What do you think this place was used for?" Mark examined the symbols, trying to decipher their meaning. As he did, Emily noticed something odd, an old diary lying on a dusty shelf. She picked it up and opened it, her flashlight casting a dim glow on the pages. The diary belonged to a man named Jonathan Wren, a local who had vanished years ago. The diary was filled with disturbing entries about rituals and dark practices. One entry caught Emily's eye. "The ritual must be performed tonight. The darkness grows stronger and the sacrifice will open the gate. It is the only way to keep the darkness at bay." Emily's heart pounded as she read the chilling words. She showed the diary to Mark, whose face had turned ashen. "This isn't just an abandoned house," Mark said, his voice shaky. "This place was used for something evil." A loud bang echoed through the chamber, causing them both to jump. The tunnel entrance was blocked by a heavy stone that had fallen, sealing them inside. "Great, just great," Emily said, panic rising in her voice. "We're trapped." Mark tried to pry the stone away, but it wouldn't budge. As they frantically searched for another way out, the whispers grew louder, almost forming words. Then Emily saw it, a shadow moving in the corner of the chamber. She turned to Mark, but he was frozen, staring at something behind her. "Mark, what is it?" Emily asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Mark slowly turned around, revealing his terrified face. "Emily, look." Emily's blood ran cold as she followed his gaze. Emerging from the shadows was a figure, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through them. It was Jonathan Wren, or what was left of him. His mouth moved in a silent scream as he reached out a hand. "We have to get out of here," Emily screamed, grabbing Mark's arm and pulling him toward the altar. In a desperate bid, they shoved the altar aside, revealing a hidden passage. They crawled through it, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if urging them to stay. They emerged back in the basement, the stone door now open. They ran up the stairs, pushing past the falling debris and escaping into the night. Outside, the forest seemed alive with strange noises, but they didn't stop. They sprinted back to the Jeep, their hearts racing. As they drove away, Emily glanced back at the farmhouse. The shadowy figure stood in the window, watching them leave. Later, when they were safe at home, they looked at the diary again. The last entry was dated the day they'd entered the house. It read, "The new sacrifice is ready. The darkness will be complete soon. The house will be sealed, but the curse will live on." Emily shuddered, realizing the truth. They had been part of a ritual and unwittingly chosen as sacrifices to keep the darkness at bay. The farmhouse wasn't just haunted, it was alive, feeding on fear and despair. They would never return to that place, but the nightmares of what they had witnessed would stay with them forever. The darkness in the hollow had not been defeated. It had only been delayed, waiting for its next victims. The farmhouse still stands, waiting in the woods, its secrets hidden behind rotting walls and darkened windows. And though Emily and Mark escape with their lives, the darkness remains, forever waiting for those who dare to enter the hollow. The Forgotten Cabin. Deep in the heart of the Adirondacks, far from any well-trodden paths, stood a weathered cabin. For years, locals spoke in hushed tones about the place, a remnant of an old logging camp swallowed by the relentless forest. They called it the Forgotten Cabin, and for good reason. It was said that those who ventured too close would vanish without a trace, swallowed by the cabin's dark, tangled secrets. When Sarah and Jake, avid urban explorers, heard the stories, they saw only challenge and thrill. They planned their excursion meticulously, packing their gear and setting out early in the morning. The dense woods offered a sense of seclusion and mystery that only fueled their curiosity. The hike was arduous, and as they trudged through the underbrush, the forest grew eerily quiet. By midday, they arrived at the cabin. It looked just as the stories described, dilapidated with broken windows and a sagging roof. Vines and moss clung to its sides, and a tattered American flag fluttered feebly in the breeze. "This is it," Jake said, his voice filled with excitement. "Let's check it out." They stepped inside, their boots crunching on the broken floorboards. The cabin's interior was a time capsule of neglect. Dust-coated furniture sat in shadows, and old photographs, their faces obscured by decay, lined the walls. A large stone fireplace dominated one side of the room, its hearth cold and empty. As they explored, Sarah noticed a small locked door at the back of the cabin. Curiosity piqued, she pointed it out to Jake. "Think there's something interesting behind it?" she asked. Jake shrugged. "Could be. Let's see if we can get it open." They searched the cabin for tools and found a rusty crowbar hidden under a pile of old newspapers. With some effort, they pried the door open. Beyond it lay a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with apprehension. Jake grinned. "Come on, where's your sense of adventure?" They descended into the basement, the air growing colder with each step. Their flashlights revealed a small, dank space filled with old crates and rusty tools. In the center of the room stood a peculiar wooden box, intricately carved with strange symbols. "Looks like we found something," Jake said, his flashlight illuminating the box's eerie carvings. Sarah examined the box closely. The symbols seemed to pulse faintly, and she felt a shiver run down her spine. Jake carefully opened it, revealing a stack of old letters and a worn leather journal. The journal was filled with bizarre entries detailing rituals and strange ceremonies conducted by the cabin's previous occupants. One entry stood out. "The cabin must remain hidden. When the moon is full and the forest sleeps, the ritual must be completed. Only then can the curse be broken." Sarah and Jake exchanged uneasy glances. The entries spoke of a curse, of sacrifices needed to appease something dark and malevolent. As they continued reading, the whispers of the forest outside grew louder, almost as if echoing the words in the journal. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out. Panic set in as the basement was plunged into darkness. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the temperature dropped dramatically. Sarah's breath came out in visible puffs as she tried to relight their lanterns. "Something's not right," Sarah said, her voice trembling. Jake's flashlight flickered erratically, casting eerie shadows on the walls. In one of the fleeting flashes, they saw a figure standing in the corner, a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes. He was dressed in tattered clothes and seemed to be watching them intently. "Jake! Look!" Sarah whispered, grabbing his arm. Jake turned, but the figure was gone. The room was eerily silent again, except for the rustling of leaves outside. "I think we should go," Jake said, his voice tense. "This place gives me the creeps." They hurried up the stairs, but as they reached the main floor, they found the front door had inexplicably shut and locked. The windows were barred from the outside, trapping them inside. A sudden crash from the basement made them jump. Sarah and Jake rushed back downstairs, only to find the wooden box missing. The basement was now eerily empty, save for the journal lying on the floor. Jake picked it up, but before he could read it, the lights flickered back on, revealing a horrifying sight. The walls of the basement were covered in grotesque symbols similar to those on the box. The basement seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, and the whispers grew louder, forming coherent words. "The ritual is complete. You are the chosen ones." A cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing their lanterns. The whispers turned into a deafening roar. The cabin seemed to close in on them, its walls vibrating with an unseen force. In a frenzy, Sarah and Jake scrambled to the stairs, desperate to escape. They burst through the front door into the forest, only to find the path they had taken completely vanished. The forest was no longer familiar. It was a labyrinth of twisted trees and dense undergrowth. As they stumbled through the dark woods, their panic turned to exhaustion. They collapsed at the edge of a small clearing, only to find themselves face to face with the gaunt figure from the basement. He spoke in a hollow voice. "You've completed the ritual. Now you belong to the cabin." Sarah and Jake's screams echoed through the night as the figure approached. The forest seemed to close in around them, swallowing their cries. The next day, when a search party found the abandoned cabin, there was no sign of Sarah and Jake. The cabin stood silent, its secrets once again hidden away. The local tales would continue, with the forest growing even more silent as it waited for its next visitors, the curse remaining unbroken, and the cabin's darkness eternally consuming those who dared to enter. The Haunting of Pinecrest Lodge. In the remote mountains of Vermont stood Pinecrest Lodge, a grand but dilapidated estate that had seen better days. Built in the early 1900s, it had been a lavish getaway for the wealthy, but a series of tragic accidents and unexplained disappearances had led to its abandonment. The locals spoke of a malevolent presence within its walls, and over time the lodge became a place whispered about only in fear. When Alex and Mia, amateur ghost hunters and thrill seekers, heard about Pinecrest Lodge, they were undeterred by the stories. Equipped with cameras, voice recorders, and a palpable sense of curiosity, they planned a weekend investigation, eager to document any paranormal activity. The drive up the winding mountain road was fraught with rain and fog. By the time they arrived at the lodge, twilight was settling in, casting long shadows across the overgrown grounds. The lodge loomed before them, its once grand facade now marred by peeling paint and broken windows. "This place is perfect," Alex said, excitement evident in his voice. "Let's set up the equipment and get started." Inside, the lodge was a haunting reflection of its former glory. Dust-covered chandeliers hung from the ceiling, and old portraits of stern-looking ancestors lined the walls. The air was thick with mildew and decay. As they set up their gear, Mia couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. "This place feels off," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. Alex waved off her concerns. "It's just an old building. Let's focus on getting some good evidence." They began their investigation, moving through the lodge with their cameras and recorders. At first, their efforts yielded little. The usual creaks and groans of an old building were their only company. But as night fell, the atmosphere shifted. The temperature dropped abruptly, and an unsettling silence settled over the lodge. While reviewing their footage in the dimly lit library, Alex noticed a strange anomaly, a shadowy figure moving across one of the camera's frames. He rewound and replayed the footage, but the figure was gone. His excitement was palpable. "Look at this," Alex said, pointing to the screen. "There's definitely something here." Mia's unease grew. "I don't know, Alex. Maybe we should just call it a night." Before Alex could respond, a loud bang echoed through the lodge, causing them both to jump. They exchanged nervous glances and decided to investigate the source of the noise. Following the sound, they ventured into the basement, a dark, musty area that seemed to stretch endlessly. The basement was cluttered with old furniture and boxes. In one corner, they found an old wooden door, slightly ajar, leading to a small, hidden room. Inside the room, they discovered a dusty old ledger and a collection of handwritten notes. The ledger contained records of guests and staff, but the notes were disturbing. They spoke of rituals and a curse placed upon the lodge by a disgruntled servant who had been wronged by the wealthy owners. One note read, "The curse will bind their souls to the lodge, forever trapped within its walls. Only those who uncover the truth can break it. But beware, once awakened, the spirits will never rest." A chill ran down Mia's spine. This is getting too creepy. I think we should leave. But Alex was undeterred. We're so close to uncovering the truth. Let's at least finish this investigation. As they prepared to leave the hidden room, the lights flickered and went out. Panic set in as they fumbled with their flashlights, only to find the basement now engulfed in darkness. The temperature plummeted, and the whispering began, an eerie, disembodied murmur that seemed to come from all directions. Suddenly, the whispers grew louder, forming a coherent, chilling message. "You cannot leave. The curse binds you now." A shadowy figure emerged from the darkness, its form indistinct but menacing. Alex and Mia's breath came in ragged gasps as they stumbled back, trying to escape. The figure seemed to move with them, always just out of reach. In their frantic attempt to flee, they raced back upstairs, only to find the lodge had changed. Hallways stretched endlessly, and the once familiar rooms were now alien and twisted. The lodge seemed to be shifting, warping around them. Desperation turned to dread as they realized they were lost. The oppressive silence was broken only by their frantic footsteps and the increasingly loud whispers. Each corner they turned seemed to lead them back to the same place, as if the lodge itself was toying with them. Eventually, they found themselves back in the library where the shadows seemed to have grown darker and more menacing. The figure was there, waiting, its hollow eyes fixed on them. Alex tried to reason with it. "We don't want any trouble. We're just here to understand." The figure's voice was a rasping whisper. "The truth was never meant to be uncovered. You are now part of the curse." Suddenly, the figure lunged at them, and a cold, suffocating darkness enveloped the room. When the darkness lifted, Alex and Mia were gone. The next morning, the lodge stood silent and still, the rain having stopped. The cameras and voice recorders were found, but the footage and audio were corrupted, only showing static and hearing the eerie whispers. Alex and Mia were never seen again. Pinecrest Lodge remains abandoned, a grim reminder of its dark past. The whispers of the spirits and the shadowy figure are said to linger, waiting for the next curious souls to stumble into the lodge's malevolent grasp. The curse remains unbroken, and the lodge's secrets are forever hidden in its haunted, shifting halls. The echoes of Hollow Manor. In the sleepy town of Ravenswood, nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, stood Hollow Manor, a once grand estate that had long since fallen into disrepair. Built in the late 1800s, the manor was known for its opulent architecture and tragic history. A series of unfortunate events, including a devastating fire and a string of mysterious disappearances, had turned it into a local legend of dread and darkness. Despite the stories that circulated about the manor, Chloe and Dan, thrill-seeking urban explorers, saw it as an irresistible challenge. They were intrigued by the idea of uncovering the truth behind the manor's haunting reputation. Armed with cameras, recording equipment, and a brave heart, they set out to explore Hollow Manor on a crisp autumn evening. As they approached the manor, the evening fog curled around the dilapidated structure, giving it an even more sinister appearance. The once beautiful facade was now marred by cracked windows and creeping ivy. An iron gate, rusted and twisted, groaned as they pushed it open. Inside, the manor was a decaying relic of its former splendor. The grand chandelier, once a centerpiece of opulence, now hung precariously from the ceiling, its crystals covered in layers of dust. The air was thick with mildew and the faint scent of ash, a haunting reminder of the fire that had ravaged the building years ago. "This place is incredible," Dan said, his voice echoing through the empty hall. "Let's get started." They set up their equipment in the grand ballroom, where the remnants of a once luxurious decor lay scattered among the debris. As they began their investigation, the manor seemed to hold its breath, an oppressive silence settling over them. The only sound was the occasional creak of the floorboards and the rustling of their gear. Hours passed with little activity. They captured some faint noises on their recorders and saw a few strange shadows on their cameras, but nothing that could definitively explain the manor's reputation. As they took a break in the library, Chloe discovered an old leather-bound journal hidden behind a stack of dusty books. The journal belonged to Margaret Holloway, the last resident of the manor. The entries detailed a growing paranoia and fear of something lurking within the manor, something she could never quite understand, but felt compelled to document. One entry, written in a frantic hand, caught Chloe's eye. The echoes are growing louder. The spirits are angry, restless. I fear they will take me soon. They seek the truth, but I cannot give it to them. Chloe showed the journal to Dan, who appeared intrigued but skeptical. Looks like she was scared out of her mind, probably just a product of her own fears. But as they continued their exploration, the atmosphere in the manor began to change. The temperature dropped suddenly, and the silence was punctuated by distant, mournful wails. The manor seemed to come alive with an unsettling energy, and every shadow seemed to writhe and shift with malevolence. They moved cautiously through the upper floors, their footsteps echoing in the empty halls. In one of the bedrooms, they found an old mirror, its surface cracked and grimy. As Dan adjusted the angle of his camera, Chloe noticed something odd in the mirror's reflection, a dark shape standing behind them. Dan, do you see that? Chloe asked, her voice trembling. Dan turned around, but the room was empty. The shape in the mirror was gone. He tried to reassure Chloe, but his voice lacked conviction. Let's just keep going, Dan said, though his tone was uncertain. They continued their investigation, but the manor's unsettling presence seemed to grow more intense. The whispers grew louder, echoing through the halls, becoming more distinct. They could make out words now, pleading and desperate. Find the truth, break the curse. As they descended into the basement, the whispers turned into a cacophony of voices, all pleading for release. The basement was a dark, foreboding space, filled with old furniture and crates. In the center of the room, they discovered a hidden trapdoor, covered in strange symbols similar to those in the journal. With some effort, they pried the door open, revealing a small, cramped room below. Inside, they found a stone altar covered in dust and old, faded candles. The walls were etched with the same symbols, and there was a large, ancient-looking book open on the altar. Dan picked up the book, flipping through its pages. The text was a mix of rituals and incantations written in a language neither of them could understand. But the book seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, and the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. Chloe's anxiety was palpable. I think we need to leave. This place it's not right. Before they could react, the basement lights flickered and went out. The whispers turned into a deafening roar. The temperature dropped, and an oppressive darkness filled the room. Chloe and Dan's flashlights went out, and they were plunged into an abyss of sound and shadow. In the darkness, they could feel the cold, clammy presence of unseen entities closing in on them. The whispers were now screams, filled with anguish and rage. Chloe and Dan stumbled blindly, desperately trying to find their way back to the stairs, but the manor seemed to shift and twist around them. Suddenly the screaming stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Chloe and Dan found themselves back in the grand ballroom, the oppressive darkness lifting. The manor was eerily calm, the echoes of the past seemingly at rest. As they made their way to the front door, they noticed a change in the atmosphere. The manor seemed to be watching them, the shadows lengthening and darkening. They pushed through the door and fled into the night, their hearts pounding with fear. The next morning, the manor was as silent as ever, its secrets still hidden. Chloe and Dan were never the whispers of Ashcroft Cabin. Nestled in a remote corner of the New England countryside, Ashcroft Cabin had long been a subject of local lore. The small, weather-beaten structure was rumored to be cursed, with stories of strange occurrences and disappearances stretching back over a century. Its isolated location and the forest that seemed to close in around it only added to the aura of mystery and dread. Emma and Tom, a couple with a penchant for the paranormal, decided to spend a weekend at Ashcroft Cabin to uncover the truth behind the rumors. Armed with an array of ghost hunting equipment and a healthy dose of skepticism, they arrived on a foggy Friday evening. The cabin appeared as expected, a crumbling relic of the past, shrouded in ivy and encircled by dense woods. "This place is perfect," Emma said, her voice filled with anticipation. "Let's get our gear set up and start exploring." They entered the cabin, its interior smelling of damp and decay. The furniture was old and covered in dust, and the air was thick with a sense of foreboding. They set up their equipment in the main room, placing cameras in each corner and positioning their voice recorders strategically around the cabin. As night fell, the cabin seemed to come alive with creaks and groans. The wind howled through the trees outside, adding an eerie soundtrack to their investigation. Emma and Tom conducted a series of EVP, electronic voice phenomena sessions, asking questions and listening intently for any signs of a response. The answers were faint and distorted, but they persisted, determined to find something substantial. Around midnight, Tom noticed a peculiar cold spot near the fireplace. He adjusted his camera, hoping to capture any anomalies. Emma, meanwhile, was examining an old journal she had found in a dusty drawer. The journal, bound in cracked leather, belonged to someone named Thomas Ashcroft. The entries were disjointed, filled with ramblings about shadows and whispers. One entry stood out. "The whispers are growing stronger. They say the cabin has a mind of its own, that it feeds on fear and sorrow. I must find a way to silence them before it's too late." Emma showed the journal to Tom, her eyes wide with concern. "This is getting strange. Do you think there's any truth to these stories?" Tom shrugged, though he looked uneasy. "It's probably just a case of someone's imagination getting the best of them. Let's keep going." They continued their investigation, but the atmosphere in the cabin grew increasingly oppressive. The temperature dropped suddenly, and the whispers began to grow louder, though they were still indistinct. The sound seemed to come from all directions, as if the cabin itself was alive. At 2 a.m., the whispers coalesced into a clear message: "Find the heart, the key to silence." Emma and Tom exchanged nervous glances. "Find the heart?" Emma repeated, her voice trembling. "What does that mean?" Tom shook his head. "I don't know, but we should check the cabin for anything unusual." They searched the cabin thoroughly, eventually finding a trapdoor beneath an old rug in the bedroom. With some effort, they pried it open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. Descending into the basement, they discovered a hidden chamber filled with strange artifacts, old books, ritualistic items, and an old, dusty chest. The chest was adorned with symbols similar to those in the journal. Tom hesitated before opening it. "Are you sure about this?" Emma nodded, her curiosity overcoming her fear. Tom carefully unlocked the chest and lifted the lid. Inside, they found a collection of old, tattered papers and a small, ornate box. The box was intricately carved with strange patterns, and as they opened it, a chill ran through the room. Inside the box was an old, rusted key and a folded piece of paper. The paper, yellowed with age, contained a single line of text: "The heart lies beneath where shadows meet." Emma and Tom looked at each other, puzzled. "Where shadows meet?" Emma wondered aloud. Tom suggested they return to the main room and examine the fireplace. As they approached, the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. They scrutinized the area around the fireplace, but found nothing of interest until Emma noticed a hidden compartment behind the mantel. With trembling hands, she pried open the compartment, revealing a small, hollow space. Inside was a hidden compartment containing a second chest, this one old and weathered. Tom used the key from the box to unlock it. Inside, they found a heart-shaped locket and a note. The note was written in a frantic scrawl. "The heart is the key. The curse will end when the locket is returned to its place. But beware, the cabin's wrath is great." As Emma and Tom read the note, the cabin seemed to react. The temperature dropped further, and the whispers turned into angry, incoherent shouts. The walls seemed to close in, and the room grew darker. Emma clutched the locket and looked around. "Where does it go?" Before Tom could respond, the cabin was plunged into darkness. They fumbled for their flashlights, but the light sources flickered and died. The whispers grew into a cacophony of wails and screams. In the pitch black, Emma and Tom felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The locket seemed to vibrate in Emma's hand, guiding her to a hidden alcove behind a bookshelf. She placed the locket in a small carved indentation and heard a click. The darkness lifted, revealing the cabin's original, untouched beauty. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, and the whispers had ceased. The fireplace crackled warmly, and the room was filled with a soothing light. They quickly gathered their equipment and left the cabin, their hearts racing. As they drove away, the cabin stood silent and serene, its dark presence seemingly gone. The next morning, the cabin was still and quiet, its secrets once again hidden. Emma and Tom's footage revealed nothing but static and the echoes of their own voices. The whispers of Ashcroft Cabin had been silenced, but the sense of unease lingered. The cabin remained a testament to the mysteries of the past, its heart now at peace, but for how long? The vanishing of Maple Hollow. In the remote countryside of New York, Maple Hollow was a quiet town with a reputation for tranquility. Yet a single unsettling structure stood out, the old Maple Hollow mansion. It had been abandoned for decades, its grandeur faded and overtaken by creeping vines and neglect. The townsfolk whispered about it, claiming it was a place where time stood still and that anyone who entered would be lost to the mansion's enigmatic forces. When Leah and Mark, two urban explorers with a passion for unraveling mysteries, heard the tales of Maple Hollow Mansion, they were intrigued. They planned a weekend adventure, armed with their cameras, recorders, and a healthy dose of skepticism. They were determined to uncover the truth behind the mansion's eerie reputation. Arriving at the mansion on a crisp autumn afternoon, they found the once majestic building shrouded in fog. Its dark windows and crumbling facade loomed over them like a specter of the past. Ignoring the shivers running down their spines, they made their way inside. The mansion's interior was a decaying spectacle of forgotten opulence. Dust-covered chandeliers hung from the ceiling, and old portraits stared down from the walls, their eyes following Leah and Mark's every move. The air was heavy with the scent of mildew and decay, and the floorboards creaked under their weight. "Let's set up here," Leah suggested, pointing to the grand hall. "This place is massive. There's bound to be something interesting." As they set up their equipment, they noticed the house seemed oddly quiet. The only sounds were the occasional creaks and groans of the old building. They began their investigation, conducting EVP sessions and recording video footage. Hours passed with little result. The cameras captured fleeting shadows and the recorders picked up indistinct whispers, but nothing that could explain the mansion's eerie reputation. As night fell, the atmosphere in the mansion shifted. The temperature dropped suddenly, and the silence grew oppressive. In the dim light of their lanterns, Leah discovered an old diary tucked away in a dusty corner. The diary belonged to Eleanor Fairchild, the last known resident of the mansion. The entries were fragmented and disturbing, filled with accounts of eerie noises and unexplained phenomena. One entry caught Leah's eye. "The house is alive. It breathes and watches. I hear it whispering my name. I must find the source before it claims me." Leah showed the diary to Mark, her expression a mix of intrigue and apprehension. "This is getting strange. We should keep exploring." They continued their investigation, but the mansion seemed to grow darker and more oppressive. The temperature plummeted, and the whispers grew louder, forming a chilling message. "Find the heart of the house. Only then will you understand." "What does that mean?" Mark asked, his voice tinged with anxiety. "I don't know," Leah admitted, "but let's see if we can find anything that fits." They explored the mansion further, discovering a hidden door behind a bookshelf in the library. The door led to a narrow staircase descending into the basement. The air grew colder as they descended, and the whispers intensified, becoming more frantic. In the basement, they found an old dusty room filled with strange artifacts. Candles, ritualistic objects, and a large ornate chest. The chest was covered in intricate symbols, and Leah noticed it matched those described in Eleanor's diary. Tom hesitated before opening it. "This feels wrong," Leah nodded. "Let's see what's inside." With a creak, the chest opened, revealing an old, leather-bound book and a heart-shaped locket. The book was filled with rituals and dark incantations, and the locket was covered in cryptic symbols. Leah picked up the locket, and the whispers grew deafening. The temperature in the room dropped further, and the walls seemed to close in on them. The book's pages rustled as if stirred by an unseen force. A final entry in the book caught Leah's eye. "The heart of the house must be returned to its rightful place. Only then will the spirits be freed and the house's hunger sated. As Leah read the entry aloud, the whispers turned into angry, incoherent shouts. The basement grew darker, and a cold, malevolent presence filled the space. Leah and Mark's flashlights flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. In the pitch black, Leah felt the locket guiding her hand. She stumbled through the darkness, the whispers growing louder and more frantic. She found a hidden alcove behind a pile of old crates, an indentation that matched the locket's shape. Desperate, Leah placed the locket in the alcove, and a sudden rush of cold air filled the room. The darkness lifted, revealing the basement's original, untouched state. The whispers faded, replaced by an eerie calm. Leah and Mark quickly gathered their equipment and made their way back to the main floor. The mansion seemed to have returned to its silent, decaying state. As they left, they glanced back at the mansion, which now seemed almost peaceful, its dark presence seemingly gone. The next morning, the mansion was still silent. Leah and Mark's footage revealed only static and the echoes of their own voices. The whispers had been silenced, and the mansion's secrets remained hidden, waiting for the next visitors. Maple Hollow Mansion stood as a reminder of its dark past, a place where the line between the living and the dead blurred. The lure of the Hollow Road. The remote stretch of Hollow Road had a reputation. Locals whispered of it, travelers warned of it, but no one really knew what happened there, only that those who ventured too far often never returned. Tucked deep in the Appalachian wilderness, Hollow Road twisted through dense forests, winding and narrowing until it was barely more than a trail. It was the perfect place to get lost. For Michael and Emily, two city dwellers looking for an adventurous getaway, the warnings seemed like nothing more than superstitions. They were seasoned hikers, having conquered mountains and traversed deserts. The idea of exploring a cursed road was more exciting than terrifying. They set out early one Saturday morning, eager to conquer the infamous path. The day was clear, and the air was crisp with the scent of pine and earth. The first few miles of Hollow Road were uneventful, if not serene. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled patterns on the ground. Michael, always the curious one, pointed out various plants and animal tracks, while Emily snapped photos, capturing the beauty of the untouched wilderness. As they ventured deeper, the trees grew closer together, their branches intertwining overhead, blocking out the sun. The air became cooler, the silence more pronounced. The road, once wide and gravelly, was now barely a trail, overgrown with weeds and roots that seemed to reach out to trip them. Emily felt a slight unease, but brushed it off. This was what they had come for, after all, the thrill of the unknown. "Looks like we've reached the heart of it," Michael said, his voice echoing slightly in the stillness. Emily nodded, but the unease in her stomach tightened. She glanced around, feeling as though they were being watched, but saw nothing. They continued walking, but the atmosphere had changed. The forest no longer felt inviting, it was oppressive, each step heavier than the last. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches clawing at their clothes. The path was nearly impossible to follow now, but Michael insisted they press on. Just as Emily was about to suggest turning back, they heard it, a faint cry, barely audible over the rustling leaves. It sounded like a woman, somewhere off the path. Michael and Emily exchanged a glance, the same question in their eyes. "Was someone out here?" "Did you hear that?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael nodded, his expression serious. "Maybe someone needs help," he replied, though his tone betrayed his uncertainty. Without waiting for a response, he started towards the sound. Emily hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn around, but she couldn't let Michael go alone. She followed, the trees seeming to close in tighter the further they ventured from the path. The cries grew louder, more desperate, leading them deeper into the woods. The underbrush was thick, the ground uneven, and the air grew colder with every step. Emily noticed something strange. The forest was completely silent except for the cries. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing but the sound of that voice. Finally, they reached a small clearing. The cries stopped abruptly, leaving them in eerie silence. At the center of the clearing was an old, decrepit cabin, barely standing, its wood rotting and the roof caved in. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. "Hello?" Michael called out, his voice shaky. No response. The silence was suffocating. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she scanned the area, looking for any sign of the person they had heard. But there was nothing. Michael approached the cabin, peering through the broken window. "I don't see anyone," he said, more to himself than to Emily. "We should go back," Emily urged, her fear now undeniable. "This doesn't feel right." Before Michael could respond, the door to the cabin creaked open on its own. They both jumped, staring at the dark entrance. A cold breeze blew through the clearing, carrying with it the faint smell of decay. "We can't just leave if someone's in there," Michael said, though his voice trembled. Reluctantly, Emily followed as he stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and the stench of something long dead. The interior was just as ruined as the outside, with broken furniture scattered about and a thick layer of grime covering everything. But there was no sign of anyone, just silence. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them, plunging the cabin into darkness. Emily screamed, fumbling for her flashlight. When she finally switched it on, the beam revealed the horrifying truth. The walls were covered in strange ancient symbols, drawn in what looked like dried blood. The floor was littered with bones, some clearly human. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she realized they were standing in the middle of a ritual site. "We need to get out of here now," she shouted, grabbing Michael's arm. But as they turned towards the door, they found it blocked by a figure. The figure was barely human, a twisted form with hollow eyes and a mouth that stretched too wide, filled with sharp, rotting teeth. It stared at them, an unnatural grin spreading across its face. "Thank you for coming," it rasped, its voice a distorted echo of the cries they had heard. "I was so lonely." Michael and Emily backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The walls seemed to close in on them, the symbols glowing faintly as if awakening to their presence. The creature stepped closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. In a panic, Michael lunged at the door, but the creature was faster. It reached out, grabbing him with inhuman strength. Emily screamed as the creature dragged Michael towards the center of the room, where a dark pit seemed to open in the floor. "Help me," Michael cried, his voice filled with terror. Emily was frozen, fear rooting her to the spot. The creature smiled at her, that wide, unnatural grin, before it pulled Michael into the pit. His screams echoed as he disappeared into the darkness. The pit closed, the cabin silent once more. The creature turned its hollow eyes on Emily, its grin widening. "You're next," it whispered. And then, everything went black. When Emily woke up, she was back on Hollow Road, alone. The sun was setting and the forest was quiet. There was no sign of the cabin, no sign of Michael. Her heart raced as she stumbled to her feet, disoriented and terrified. She ran faster than she ever had, the path seeming endless as the shadows stretched around her. When she finally emerged from the forest, breathless and trembling, she collapsed by the side of the road. A passing car stopped, and the driver, an elderly man, helped her to her feet. "You're lucky to be alive," he said gravely. "No one's ever made it out of there before." Emily stared at him, her mind reeling. "What happened to Michael?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The man's face turned pale. "Who?" It was then that Emily realized there had never been a Michael. She had come to Hollow Road alone, and she had never left. The watcher in the field. The farm had been in Megan's family for generations, a vast expanse of rolling fields bordered by thick woods. It was a place of solitude and routine, where time moved slowly and the world beyond the dirt roads felt distant and irrelevant. But Megan loved it. After inheriting the property from her grandfather, she'd left her life in the city behind, trading the noise and chaos for the peace of rural living. It was late September, and the air was crisp with the first hints of autumn. Megan was preparing the fields for the winter, a task that was both exhausting and rewarding. She spent her days out in the fields, working from dawn until dusk, with only the sound of the wind and the occasional crow for company. The isolation didn't bother her. If anything, it was a comfort. But lately, something had begun to feel off. It was subtle at first, a sense of being watched, a rustle in the cornfields when there shouldn't have been. She dismissed it as nerves, the remnants of city life clinging to her in the quiet of the countryside. But the feeling grew stronger with each passing day. It gnawed at her, making her glance over her shoulder more often than usual. The fields, once her sanctuary, now felt ominous, the tall corn stalks whispering secrets as the wind passed through them. The woods at the edge of the property seemed darker, as though something was lurking just beyond the tree line. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Megan was finishing up her work when she noticed something strange. A figure stood at the far edge of the field, just where the corn ended and the woods began. It was too far away to make out any details, but she could see that it was tall, with a distorted shape that didn't look entirely human. She stared at it, heart pounding, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching her. Megan felt a chill run down her spine. She had never been afraid out here before, but something about that figure filled her with dread. She turned away, trying to convince herself it was just her imagination, but when she looked back, the figure was gone. The field was empty, as if nothing had ever been there. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Megan tossed and turned, her mind replaying the image of the figure over and over. She told herself it was just a trick of the light, perhaps a scarecrow that she hadn't noticed before. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. The next day, Megan went back to work, determined to put the incident out of her mind. But as the day wore on, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. She caught glimpses of movement out of the corner of her eye, but whenever she turned to look, there was nothing there. By late afternoon, her nerves were frayed. She decided to call it a day and head back to the house early. As she walked across the field, she felt a presence behind her, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. She quickened her pace, resisting the urge to turn around, but the feeling only intensified. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. She spun around, ready to confront whatever was following her. But there was nothing, just the rustling corn and the darkening sky. She let out a shaky breath, feeling foolish for letting her imagination get the best of her. But then she heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper carried on the wind. It was faint, but it was there, a voice that seemed to come from all around her. Megan. Her blood ran cold. She knew that voice. It was her grandfather's, but he had been dead for over a year. The whisper came again, closer this time, sending a wave of terror through her. Megan, come home. She broke into a run, her heart pounding in her chest. The house was in sight, but it felt impossibly far away. The whispering followed her, growing louder, more insistent. Megan, come home. She reached the house, slammed the door behind her, and locked it, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispering stopped abruptly, leaving only silence. Megan stood in the entryway, shaking, her mind racing. What was happening to her? That night, the dreams began. She was in the field, surrounded by tall corn that seemed to stretch on forever. The air was thick, suffocating, and she could feel something moving through the stalks, circling her, getting closer. She tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The whispers filled her head, louder and louder, until she thought she would go mad. When she woke, the sheets were soaked with sweat, and the whispers still echoed in her mind. She didn't go to the fields that day. Instead, she stayed inside, every door and window locked. But the sense of being watched didn't leave her. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in on her, trapping her. As night fell, the whispers returned, seeping through the walls, filling the house with their insidious murmur. Megan, come home. She couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing her coat, she fled the house, desperate to escape the voices. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away. But her feet seemed to have a mind of their own, leading her back to the fields. The night was dark, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. The wind whipped through the corn, making the stalks sway and rustle like living things. The whispers grew louder as she approached the edge of the field, where the woods loomed like a dark, impenetrable wall. And there it was again, the figure. It stood just at the edge of the woods, its shape clearer now in the dim light. It was tall and thin, its limbs elongated, its face obscured by shadow. But there was something familiar about it, something that made Megan's breath catch in her throat. The figure raised a hand, beckoning her closer. Against her will, she felt her feet move forward, drawn towards it by an invisible force. As she approached, the figure stepped out of the shadows, and Megan's heart stopped. It was her grandfather, or at least something that looked like him. But his face was wrong, twisted, unnatural, with eyes that were too large, too dark, and a smile that stretched too wide. Megan, he whispered, his voice echoing with the chorus of whispers around her. It's time to come home. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure reached out, its long fingers brushing against her skin, and everything went black. When the sun rose the next morning, the fields were silent. The wind blew gently through the corn, and the birds sang their morning songs. There was no sign of Megan, no trace of her ever having been there. The farm stood empty, the house abandoned. But deep in the fields where the corn grew thick and tall, the whispers still lingered, carried on the wind, calling for someone new to come home. The forgotten ones. The road to Gable's End was one that most people avoided, and for good reason. It wasn't just the sharp turns or the thick, enveloping woods that made the journey treacherous. It was the stories, whispers of disappearances, strange lights, and shadowy figures that roamed the forest. But for Clara, the isolated town at the end of the road was a lifeline, a place she'd been forced to move to after losing her job and the last of her savings. Clara had no family, no friends left in the city. Gable's End was her last option, a forgotten town that promised cheap rent and work in exchange for solitude. Desperation pushed her to accept the offer without hesitation. The idea of a fresh start, even in a place shrouded in mystery, was better than the bleakness she was leaving behind. The drive was long and lonely, the road narrowing as it wound deeper into the forest. The trees grew thicker, their branches intertwining overhead to form a tunnel of shadows. As the sun dipped below the horizon, darkness settled in quickly, leaving only the pale glow of Clara's headlights to pierce the night. The GPS flickered, then died, leaving Clara to rely on the worn map that had come with the keys to her new home. The directions were straightforward, but the feeling of being watched gnawed at her. The forest seemed alive, with every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig making her jump. Finally, the trees parted, revealing the small town nestled in a valley. Gable's End was as quaint as the photographs had shown. A cluster of old, weathered buildings, their windows dark, save for a few flickering lights. The streets were empty, silent, as if the town was holding its breath. Clara's new home was a modest cottage at the edge of town, backed by the forest. The landlord had assured her it was in good condition, but as she approached, Clara noticed the sagging roof and the overgrown yard. It was clear no one had lived here in a long time. She parked the car. The engines rumbled, dying away into the stillness. As she stepped out, the quiet was almost oppressive. The only sound, her footsteps on the gravel. She fumbled with the keys, finally unlocking the door and stepping inside. The air was stale, carrying the scent of dust and neglect. Clara turned on the lights, relieved when they flickered to life, casting a warm, if dim, glow over the small living room. The cottage was furnished with basic, outdated pieces, an old sofa, a creaky wooden table, and a bed that looked like it had seen better days. But it was enough. Clara unpacked her things, trying to shake the unease that had settled in her chest since she'd arrived. That night, sleep eluded her. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind outside the windows set her on edge. She had always been sensitive to sounds, but this felt different. It felt like something was in the house with her, lurking just out of sight. The next morning, Clara set out to explore the town. She walked the empty streets, passing by shuttered shops and abandoned houses. The few people she did see barely acknowledged her, their faces pale and drawn. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of resignation that hung over everything. At the general store, the only business that seemed to be open, Clara met Mrs. Thompson, a kind but tired-looking woman in her 60s who ran the place. "New in town, I see," Mrs. Thompson said as she rang up Clara's groceries. "Not many people move to Gable's End these days." Clara smiled politely. "Yes, I'm hoping to make a fresh start." Mrs. Thompson's expression grew somber. "Be careful, dear. This place, it has a way of holding on to you." Clara didn't know how to respond, so she nodded and thanked her, hurrying out of the store. The cryptic warning gnawed at her as she walked back to the cottage. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that unseen eyes were following her every move. That night, the unease grew into full-blown dread. The house felt wrong. Too quiet, too still. The shadows seemed to move, shifting in the corners of her vision. And then there were the voices. Soft, indistinct murmurs that drifted through the walls, just at the edge of hearing. Clara lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her heart pounding. She told herself it was just the stress of the move, that she was letting her imagination get the best of her. But the voices wouldn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent, until they filled the room with a chorus of whispers. And then, just as suddenly as they had begun, the voices stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing down on her until she couldn't breathe. And then she heard it, the slow, deliberate creak of a floorboard just outside her bedroom door. Clara froze, her breath caught in her throat. Someone was in the house. The doorknob rattled, then slowly began to turn. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to move. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. And then, out of the shadows, a figure stepped into the room. It was a man, tall and gaunt, his face pale and hollow-eyed. But there was something wrong with him, something unnatural. His movements were stiff, jerky, as if he were a puppet on strings. "Get out!" he rasped, his voice a low growl. "You don't belong here." Clara finally found her voice and screamed. She scrambled out of bed, running for the door, but the figure was faster. He grabbed her arm, his grip icy cold. His eyes bored into hers, filled with a desperate, haunting sorrow. "Get out before it's too late," he whispered, his voice trembling, "before you become one of us." With a surge of adrenaline, Clara wrenched herself free and bolted out of the house, not stopping until she reached her car. She fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking, finally managing to start the engine. As she sped away, she glanced back at the cottage. The figure stood in the doorway, watching her go, his form slowly dissolving into the shadows. Clara didn't stop driving until she was miles away, back on the main highway, the town of Gable's End far behind her. She pulled over to the side of the road, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her heart pounding in her chest. It was only then that she realized she was not alone. In the rearview mirror, she saw the gaunt figure sitting in the back seat, his hollow eyes staring back at her. "You can never leave," he whispered. "Once you're here, you're forgotten, just like the rest of us." Clara screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness as the world around her faded away, leaving only the endless road, the whispering trees, and the inescapable presence of the forgotten ones. The Midnight Caller. On the outskirts of a small town, nestled deep in the Midwest, there was an old house known to the locals as the Maddox Place. It stood at the end of a long, lonely road, surrounded by thick woods. No one had lived there in decades, and the townspeople avoided it, claiming it was haunted. Stories were passed down about strange lights in the windows, mysterious sounds in the night, and the eerie feeling of being watched when passing by. Despite its ominous reputation, Jenna couldn't resist the allure of the Maddox Place when she saw it listed for sale online. The price was unbelievably low, almost as if the realtor was desperate to get rid of it. Jenna, a freelance writer who thrived on solitude, saw it as an opportunity to escape the chaos of the city and work on her novel in peace. The idea of living in a haunted house intrigued her more than it scared her. She moved in on a bright, chilly day in October. The house was as old and creaky as she'd imagined, with wooden floors that groaned underfoot and wallpaper that was peeling at the edges. The previous owners left most of the furniture behind, giving the place a lived-in feel despite its abandonment. Jenna felt a strange connection to the house, as if it had been waiting for her. The first few days were uneventful. Jenna spent her time unpacking, exploring the house, and settling into her new routine. The isolation was exactly what she had hoped for. No neighbors, no distractions, just the quiet of the countryside. At night, the only sounds were the wind in the trees and the occasional creak of the house settling. But on the fifth night, just as she was drifting off to sleep, the phone rang. Jenna jolted awake, disoriented. She had almost forgotten about the old rotary phone in the hallway, an antique that came with the house. She hadn't bothered to set up the landline, so the phone shouldn't have been working at all. Confused, she got out of bed and padded down the hallway. The phone rang again, its shrill tone echoing through the quiet house. Jenna hesitated, then picked up the receiver. "Hello?" she said, her voice shaky. For a moment, there was nothing but static on the other end. Jenna frowned, about to hang up when she heard a faint, raspy voice. Is anyone there?" Jenna's heart skipped a beat. The voice was weak, almost a whisper, like someone struggling to speak. "Yes, I'm here," Jenna replied. "Who is this?" There was a pause, then the voice came again, more insistent this time. "Help me. Please." Jenna's blood ran cold. The desperation in the voice was palpable, sending a shiver down her spine. "Who are you?" she demanded, her grip tightening on the receiver. The line went dead. Jenna stood there for a moment, the receiver still pressed to her ear, her mind racing. She told herself it was probably a prank, some local kid trying to scare the new resident of the Maddox place. But deep down, she knew it was something more. The next day, Jenna tried to shake off the incident. She busied herself with writing, telling herself it was just a strange occurrence, nothing to worry about. But as night fell, the unease returned. She kept glancing at the old phone, dreading the thought of it ringing again. And then, just past midnight, it did. Jenna's heart pounded as she stared at the phone, its harsh ring cutting through the silence. She didn't want to answer it, but something compelled her to. With trembling hands, she picked up the receiver. "Who is this?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. There was static again, then the same raspy voice from the night before. "Please, help me." Jenna swallowed hard, her mouth dry. "What do you want? How can I help you?" The voice was clearer this time, though still faint. "I'm trapped. I need you to find me." "Where are you?" Jenna asked, her fear giving way to a strange sense of determination. The voice was fading, the static growing louder. "In the house. I'm in the house." The line went dead again. Jenna stood there, shaking. The voice had sounded so real, so desperate, she couldn't ignore it. Against her better judgment, she decided to search the house, hoping to find some explanation for the calls. Armed with a flashlight, Jenna started in the basement. It was dark and damp, the air heavy with the smell of mildew. She swept the beam of light over the walls, the old furniture, the cobwebs in the corners, but found nothing out of the ordinary. Next, she searched the first floor, checking every room, every closet, but everything was as it should be. By the time she reached the second floor, exhaustion was setting in. The house was quiet, still, as if it too was waiting for something. As Jenna passed by the guest bedroom, she noticed something she hadn't before, a small door set low in the wall, almost hidden behind a wardrobe. It was old and weathered, with a rusty iron handle. Curiosity piqued, she tugged the wardrobe aside and crouched down to inspect the door. It creaked open to reveal a narrow staircase leading up into the attic. Jenna hesitated, her mind flashing back to the voice on the phone. Was this where the caller was? Taking a deep breath, she climbed the stairs, the old wood groaning under her weight. The attic was cold, the air thick with dust. The single window at the far end was covered in grime, allowing only a sliver of moonlight to filter in. Jenna shone her flashlight around, the beam catching on old trunks, broken furniture, and piles of forgotten belongings. And then she saw it, a small figure huddled in the corner, its back to her. Jenna's heart raced as she approached, the flashlight trembling in her hand. "Hello?" she called out, her voice shaking. The figure didn't move. As Jenna drew closer, she realized it wasn't a person at all. It was a doll, old and worn, its porcelain face cracked and faded. It sat in a small wooden chair, its glassy eyes staring blankly ahead. Jenna let out a shaky laugh, feeling foolish. She had been terrified of a doll. But as she turned to leave, she noticed something strange about the wall behind the doll. A faint outline of a door, almost invisible in the darkness. She pushed the doll aside and pressed her hands against the wall. The wood gave way under her touch, revealing a hidden door. It creaked open, and Jenna shone her flashlight into the small, dark space beyond. Inside, she saw a small makeshift bed, old and tattered, as if someone had been living there. And there, lying on the bed, was a skeleton, curled up as if it had died in its sleep. Jenna gasped, stumbling back, her flashlight slipping from her hand. As it hit the floor, the light flickered, casting eerie shadows across the room. And then, from the darkness, the voice came again, louder this time, clear and filled with sorrow. "Thank you for finding me." Jenna's breath caught in her throat as she realized what had happened. The phone calls, the voice, the hidden room, it all made sense now. The spirit of someone long forgotten, trapped in the walls of the house, had been reaching out to her, begging to be found. As the realization settled over her, the air in the attic seemed to lighten. The oppressive feeling that had hung over the house lifted, replaced by a sense of peace. Jenna left the attic, closing the hidden door behind her. She didn't sleep that night, but she didn't feel afraid anymore. The phone didn't ring again, and the house, once eerie and foreboding, now felt calm. The next day, Jenna contacted the local authorities, who confirmed her suspicions. The remains were those of a young girl who had gone missing decades ago, the daughter of the house's original owners. Her parents had died in a car crash, and the house had been abandoned shortly after, the girl's fate remaining a mystery, until now. As the days passed, Jenna settled into her new life at the Maddox place, the dark history of the house now a part of its story. She no longer feared the phone ringing in the middle of the night or the creaks and groans of the old wood. The house had found peace, and so had she. But every so often, late at night, when the wind howled through the trees, Jenna would hear a faint whisper, a voice from the past saying thank you, and she would smile, knowing that the spirit she had freed was finally at rest.